And good morning. Welcome to, and good evening. Welcome to the History Behind, our fourth such episode from TMHistoryIcons. We're very fortunate today to have Anna Funder with us, joining us all the way from Sydney. And we hope that today will be an opportunity to talk through question and answers about her book, The 2003 Stasi Land. I'd like to introduce today also a little bit of a background to Anna. Anna is the author of the international bestseller Stasi Land, which was the 2004 Samuel Johnson Prize winner and has been translated, I need to get this right, into 16 different languages in 28 countries. As one of Australia's most acclaimed writers, she studied English literature, German and law in Melbourne and West Berlin. She's a former DAAD, Berlin Australia Council and Rockefeller Foundation Fellow. Anna is HTS Luminary and a Chancellor's Postdoctorate Fellow. She joins us today from Sydney, 11 hours ahead. Thank you for agreeing to talk to us today, Anna, and we warmly welcome you on behalf of the team.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
So I just wanted to look at the how we're going to set up today. First of all, we have a set of feeds. Our hashtag is The History Behind. That's The History Behind, which is a hashtag that you can follow. Post questions as you wish. You can do this through Periscope, YouTube, or should you wish, you can contact us through the hashtag and follow in the chat. So today we've got a Q&A. The first question we'd like to start with is your first book, okay, Anna, in 2003, took 4 years to complete. Where did you begin?
Yeah, so my books all, well, the two big ones have taken 4 or 5 years each. It seems to be the way that it seems to be about my pace, unfortunately. It's quite hard to say where Stasi Land began. So the first thing I should say is that I'm not an historian. I know I'm talking to historians, and so that means I'm slightly in awe of you all and also really happy to be corrected. That said, I studied at the University of Melbourne, but I was doing, as well as law, I was doing German and literature. And I had the chance when I was 20, turning 21, to study in what was then West Berlin for the winter semester of 87 to 88. So just a year and a bit before the wall came down. And I'd grown up during the Cold War when we thought really that some doddery leader like Reagan, who now looks like quite a mild leader of the US, was nevertheless going to fall on the red button and blow us all to smithereens, or the Russians were going to. So as an undergraduate, I was studying in West Berlin, which was the city with a wall around it. And I got to know a group of former East German writers and artists who had been kicked out of East Germany. So they'd literally been, in very difficult circumstances, turfed over the wall into exile 100 meters, 200 meters from their wives and children and pasts from the world that they knew. And I really just accidentally fell in among them. They were mostly men, they were mostly a lot older than I was, and I became extremely curious about what kind of place kicks out these extraordinary writers and painters mainly, and some musicians. So I'd gone to a Catholic school in Melbourne where we were taught that we shouldn't really judge communism. It could be a better system. My school was very big on social justice, and so was communism, so they were prepared to give it the benefit of the doubt. They also said things like they got rid of the exploitative nature of between capital and labour, and there was no prostitution and there was no drug problem. Both of those things were untrue, as was the exploitation. It was just of a different nature. But I was really curious about that. And so I think then, you know, my fate was sealed, and I was then doomed or destined or something to explore human nature through this prism of 20th century politics at its most extreme, and that was really at the Berlin Wall. So that's the origin of that book. It took 4 years because I'm slow, because it took a lot of thinking about how to do it. At first, I thought I was going to write a novel. You know, I thought as a writer that would probably be the good thing, the best thing to do. And then it became really very clear to me, partly because I wrote a chapter that was just appalling and execrable in its own terms, but really because of the nature of the material, it became clear that that was not the right form to use that material in. It wasn't aesthetically right, or I couldn't do it. And it wasn't, not to sound too sort of highfalutin about it, it wasn't, it's a kind of moral question too. What was it appropriate to use, in a sense, other people's true stories as material for something else, for some other kind of art form, when those stories were not being told at the time? And I started Stasi Land in 1997, or started what became Stasi Land in 1997. And I think, I mean, I'm talking as if those issues were clear to me at the time. They were not. They were things that became clear by writing bad stuff and by working out why. I felt that these stories were not being told, that they might never be told. That's a whole other question. So the stories of conscience and courage among ordinary people, not the famous civil rights activists, not the famous or infamous Stasi men, but just the ordinary people of extraordinary kind of conscience, really, and courage. If they weren't going to be told, it wasn't for me to fictionalise that. They should exist in some real form in the world. And that's why I ended up writing Stasi Land, which then, given that framework that it was going to be non-fiction, had to have all of these stories that each reflected another tiny but possibly important aspect of life in the GDR, separate from one another, and each also reflected a different era. And then how would they hang together? And they had to hang together by having a narrator, and that narrator was me. So all of that is a kind of behind-the-scenes work that takes place at the same time as I was doing all of these interviews and trying to find, for instance, Stasi men to talk to. They were all men. It was a men's club. And they were quite hard to find. But that's a whole other story, which I'm happy to tell you, but I will stop that answer there.
That'd be great. Thank you, Anna. That's a fantastic background to putting together how you started with the idea. And based on how diverse some of your interviewees were, what surprised you most when you interviewed them?
The first person that I found, I was living, so I was in my late 20s, I was living in Berlin. I did the work for this book after the wall came down. It would not have been possible, obviously, for those people who've read it to do this work when the wall was up. Even if I had access to East Germany, which I did have before when the wall was still up, there was no way that I was going to be finding Stasi men to talk to me, and they certainly wouldn't have told me what they told me. So this was all happening in the 90s, mainly from 97 to 2000. And I went to the museum in Leipzig, which was, some of you will certainly know it. It's a museum in the Runde Ecke, the round corner in Leipzig, and that is a museum of the civil rights movement that is in the building that used to be the Stasi headquarters for Saxony. And it was a very moving museum, a very real museum, because it was still run by the civil rights activists. I think it might still be, who were involved in storming that building in 1989. And they were let in by very bewildered Stasi recruits there. And I talked to a woman there called Frau Hollitzer. This is actually in Stasi Land, I tell the story. And I ended up getting to know her a little bit and staying with her and so on. And when I asked her, look, I think this thing was coalescing in my mind that I wanted to do, she said to me, you should talk to Miriam. So on another trip, I went to Leipzig and I went to talk to Miriam. And Frau Hollitzer has said to me, she has a story, I should leave it for her to tell. It involves her husband. It involves the Stasi. I didn't know much about it. And then when I actually got to Miriam and I she told me this extraordinary story that I wasn't expecting, of trying to climb the wall when she was 16 in 1968, of nearly getting over, of being arrested by the Stasi, of being tortured with sleep deprivation age 16, of this ridiculous trial where she was accused of perhaps nearly starting World War III because the East German guards might have shot to kill her, and then the West German guards would have shot back, and then Armageddon would have broken loose and so on. And then that story went into this death in Stasi custody of her husband. It was such an extraordinary story that I got back on the train exhausted from listening, which sounds bizarre, but listening well is exhausting. And I said to my flatmates at the time, I have found the anchor story for this book. And they just looked at me like, you're a crazy woman. A, what book? And B, how do you know you're not going to find much better stories? And I just had this feeling that her story contained so much, and she was so funny in the telling of it, that she had this point of view that was a point of view that I could happily inhabit, which was a point of view that recognized the big picture history, that recognized the ridiculousness even of her own torture, which is a strange sentence, but is true. And that therefore I could inhabit that and sort of manage to look at this regime from both the very, very personal experience of it and the big picture of it.
And Anna, were you conscious, was it a conscious decision for her story to be first in your book and then you return to it at the end?
The structure of a book like that is, yes, that was a conscious decision. Yeah, so I didn't put it all together until I had the other stories. So the stories divide themselves into, essentially, there are 4 main stories, and they are the stories of the people who resisted the Stasi. So there's Miriam, Frau Paul, whose baby, and when the war went up, the baby ends up in a hospital, very, very ill, on the western side, and she's on the eastern side. And that event turns her into what the state called a criminal. Klaus Renft, the very charming alcoholic rock star, very, very famous, the Mick Jagger of the Eastern Bloc. So he was my one exception to the non-famous rule. And Julia, my landlady, who wasn't really a landlady. I mean, she was my age. I just sublet from her. And then on the other side, there are the stories of the Stasi Men. So I was interested in looking, once I had these stories of extraordinary resistance, because the pressure put on people to inform and to betray everyone around them was enormous. You know, it was like a huge, the entire country was run on blackmail, essentially, to get people to betray everyone around them to the state, so the state could control you. So then I wanted to go and talk to Stasi Men, and this was 97. So on the one hand, people were saying to me, oh, we know everything about that regime, which had fallen 7 years before. What could you possibly be interested in, and what do you think you're going to find? And on the other hand,
and that's not long ago, is it? 7 years really isn't.
That's not that long. I mean, when you're young, I was in my 20s, it seemed like a long time ago. And there had been a lot in the papers in Germany, obviously, and worldwide about this surveillance regime that had been uncovered, that not even the West German Secret Service knew the extent of. I mean, they really didn't. And things kept coming in the archives. But it was by no means over. I think it's still not over. I mean, we're still finding out things now. But what people did say to me is, you will never find, those Stasi men have gone to ground, they've disappeared. They will never talk to you. Actually, it was a young woman at a party who was doing her master's, trying to look for Stasi men to talk to her. And I said to her, well, how do you know they won't talk to me? And she said, because I've tried and they won't talk to me. And I said, what did you do? So this is probably for historians or history teachers, this is how not to do research, really, but which is at parties in a very ad hoc way. But she said, well, I wrote 147 letters and I put them into the letterboxes of where the Stasi men all live, in these high rises in Marzahn. and I got 4 responses. That's all I got. And they were all anonymous, carefully worded letters giving me reasons why they would absolutely, under no circumstances, talk to me. So I thought, I don't have the patience for that. I'm not going to do it. And I thought I'll take out an advertisement in the newspaper in Potsdam, the Märkische Allgemeine, which is where it was a big administrative headquarters for the Stasi. So I did, and my German is reasonable, but I was unsure that I was getting the wording right. You know, for your students, and for some of you, this will sound like such ancient history, but before the internet, you would have little classified advertisements in local newspapers, and I wanted to write one of those where people might advertise for a gardener or, you know, household help or something. So I drafted this ad and I had someone read it for me, and then it went into the newspaper. But when I opened the newspaper in a copy, they had put my advertisement into the personal columns, and the personal columns of those papers contained, you know, the kind of blue ads, what you would now find on the maybe not so deep internet, but basically they were, you know, ads for love of various kinds. And my ad read, Australian writer seeks Stasi Men, view conversation, you know, and it had my phone number because it had a landline. There were no mobiles in I didn't have one in 1997 in Berlin. So I had to sit by the phone in my dingy apartment in Berlin and wait for the phone to ring and wonder whether any ex-Stasi men would ring. And as it happened, they did. So a lot of them rang, and they were obviously a self-selected group who had something to say. And then I went and did a whole series of interviews with various ones, and then I chose the ones that were either most interesting or most representative or most important in showing the methods in different sections of the Stasi. So then I put the book together, but I wanted it to sort of stand and have a structure a bit like a Roman arch, in a way, where you have a keystone in the middle, and that keystone is Miriam, and so she's holding it up, really, to mix my metaphors from beginning to end. So that's a sort of potted version of the method.
And when you got to the point where you were able to secure some interviews, how did you prepare for interviews? For example, preparing an interview for Julia or Klaus, how did you approach that? Did you have a series of questions that you were conscious you wanted to ask, or did you just let them speak? How did you approach it?
I had, going back a long time now, so this book exists in embryonic form in 10, you know, kind of moleskin-sized notebooks, which I took to me to these interviews. I would have had some questions. I would have had, so we're talking pre-internet, as much information as I could find about them, whoever they were. But in the case of the Stasi men, they would often not tell me their real names. You know, have Vince would, or tell me the real name and say, you can't use it. Meet me in one of them wanted to meet me in the town square of Potsdam at 1500 hours sharp. He would have the Märkische Allgemeine rolled up under his left arm. I mean, there was still a bit of clandestine or pantomime clandestine stuff going on. So I couldn't research them personally. I read an enormous amount about the Stasi as an organization as that news was coming out and being discovered. Particularly, I had a good friend, Lawrence Prell, who was the lawyer who worked at what was then the Stasi File Authority, and he helped me a lot. There were various victims organizations, victims of Stalinism and victims of the Stasi organizations, and they had pamphlets and seminars and so on. But in terms of actually dealing with each person, I went in with a very open mind, but when I look back on it, there were things that I was looking for. I was looking for, and it varied with the people who resisted. I was looking for them to tell me their story in a way where they identified their own behavior, where they could somehow, it's very hard for people to look back on something that is traumatic and find a grain of agency in it, of heroism in it. And that's what I saw. Whereas those people who resisted the Stasi and went to prison and had their lives very effectively and insidiously ruined by the Stasi are almost always called victims in Germany. And that's not what I was seeing, because they were very, very brave people who just refused to do this horrible, horrible Stasi work. So I was kind of looking for that, but really I wanted very, very open questions. And we were obviously talking in German, so it was easy for them. I recorded everything and took notes. With the Stasi men, they were more schooled, obviously, in self-promotion.
They were trained to answer questions and ask questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, they were. I suppose my favourite interview is not an actual Stasi man. That's not my favourite interview, but just in terms of how it went and preparation, somebody who was the most schooled at asking questions, apart from possibly the very clever spy who worked in the West, pretending to be a Westerner in order to influence Western votes in Parliament and so on, very sophisticated man. Karl Eduard von Schnitzler, who was a kind of, I'm trying to think of the British equivalent. Is it like an evil Jeremy Paxman or something, or an evil Stephen Fry? But that's unimaginable. But, he was a very big television personality.
So celebrity at the time. Total
celebrity, but also quite hated. So none of those British examples really apply. But, he would be on television every night, and his job, once the East German regime realized that people, so in the sort of late 70s and 80s, people were going to watch Western television. They were going to have their antennae turned towards the West, and they would be finding out things from the West. There was no way of stopping that, and they couldn't actually put everybody in jail more than they already were behind the wall for having their antennae pointed the wrong way. So then the antidote to that was this man. He was a human antidote to he was a human fake news machine. He was a human propagandist for the regime, and his job was to have a program that came on after the news every night, and in which he critiqued the news and said, can you believe this capitalism? Can you believe the destruction it's doing to the environment? Can you believe this rape case in Munich? Can you believe this and that and the other? And apparently the East German electricity, which seemed to run on hamsters but actually ran on brown coal, would suffer this terrible surge, because as soon as he came on, and he was known as Karl Eduard von Schnee, because that people would run to their televisions, this dates everything, but in the age before remote controls, and turn off the television quickly so as not to have to listen to him. And there would be this backsurge in electricity that caused outages, because the mass extinguishing of this man from the box. But interviewing him was something I was quite nervous about, because he was so infamous and so volatile and so angry and so tough. And he did yell at me. But what I found was I was extremely happy to be interviewing him, and I hung on to that through the whole thing. And I also, I think this happens to probably more, it's not just peculiar to my own strange psychology, but if somebody's getting really, really angry, it's quite interesting, because they must have something to hide, or they must be trying to bully and intimidate you. And either way, that's quite interesting. And so, the interview is very much as I represented it. It's actually quite funny. It's quite Monty Python-esque in the book. I think because he was just not used to people really asking him questions.
Hard questions, yeah.
Questions, yeah.
Great. Carol, I know we've had a lot of questions, a lot of interest coming through. Is there any questions from the feed that you could share and that Anna might be able to answer? Can I just remind everyone, thank you for using the hashtag #TheHistoryBehind. Carol, anything that's come through?
Yeah, we can see on, if you look on the comment box on the side, we've got the one that's most relevant at the minute is off Twitter from Interrupter, and it's wondering why all the Stasi were men, or were all the Stasi men?
Yes, the Stasi was entirely male. In fact, the leadership of East Germany was entirely male. So that was one of the, I suppose, the hypocrisies or the of what the East Germans called socialism, which we call communism. Socialism being technically their word for we haven't yet completed our process to becoming communists. You know, the promised perfect society is still to come. Essentially, it's the same thing. So there, you know, the rhetoric was that women were equal. Women were certainly working, and wages were ostensibly equal. I don't think they actually were. I think there was still a gender gap. But yes, the leadership, the Politburo was entirely male, and the Stasi was entirely male. There were women who were secretaries. There were women who worked as spies to trap people. They used female prostitutes to trap people in the West. But yeah, it was a militaristic organization. It was an it styled itself as the internal army to protect East Germany, essentially from any unauthorized thinking or action that threatened the powers that be, that threatened the Politburo. So its job was to know everything about everyone. It had spies or informers in every school, every kindergarten, every pub, every apartment block, every community organisation, and all the churches. There was someone everywhere reporting on everybody else, usually more than one person, so that they could cross-reference what someone said against what someone else said. So,
and Anna, why do you think they were so successful at that? They weren't, you know, it seems to be something that was embedded throughout every aspect of life, and almost it kind of accepted as part and parcel of living in the GDR. Why do you think they were able to do that?
Well, that's an interesting question. They were able to do it because there were 200,000 Stasi employees and unofficial collaborators, they called them, and then a further network of informers. So there was, in a country of 17 million. So they were incredibly thorough. They were backed by the Soviet Union. So they're, you know, as we know, Putin had his early career in Dresden as a KGB agent. So they were militarily backed by the Soviet Union. And the once that level of surveillance exists, what the Stasi can do or threaten to do to your life if you don't inform on everybody or do what they want, it can range from, you know, your sister will never study at the university, you will never study at the university, your parents will lose their jobs, you will never work. I mean, these things are all in the stories in the book, or you'll go to prison, or you'll disappear, or you'll be kicked out of the country. So the methods of control were effective, they were terrifying, they were inhumane. And the worst one, which was actually an East German specialty, was something called Zersetzung, which really is the closest you get in English is a sort of gaslighting. A German person once translated it to me as, so I'm just going to turn it off, translated it to me as trying to make someone disintegrate from the inside. And that was where they would put agents in every aspect of your life and ruin your marriage. So they would, it's a bit like trolling today, actually very similar. It's a way to ruin somebody psychologically and cause a breakdown by ruining their relationship with the world and everyone in it. So they'd spread rumors that you were unfaithful, that you stole at work, that you were an alcoholic, whatever it was. And people would therefore sort of, it saved them taking people to prison because they would just be collapsed at home and ineffectual. So it was just so vicious. I think that's why it was so effective. I mean, we don't know exactly what's going on in North Korea, but it will be very similar.
And I was thinking whilst you're saying that, the Mick Jagger of GDR, when he went into the room and said that actually he no longer existed as a band.
Yes.
And he just couldn't understand how that possibly could happen by just one person saying it, and yet it did. It ended his music career for at least for a short time, and it seems to be that was the power they held over people.
Yes, so that story is incredible. He was a lovely man. He's dead now, but so that was an instance of control of the art. So he was a rock band. They were bigger than the Beatles, you know. They played everywhere and they were wild. But like every art form, it was controlled by the state. So they had to go to a committee to get a license to perform for the next year. And he had heard that they were going to be banned. This is in 1976. They were going to be banned because they had protested about a very famous and wonderful kind of Bob Dylan figure called Wolf Biermann, who is still alive, and he's in West Germany. And he was kicked out for being outspoken. He was kicked out, and many, many artists and writers in 76 signed a petition to the government saying, we object to Wolf Biermann's being forced into exile. And so that the government then took that list as a list of people to imprison or get rid of as well, including Klaus. So he turns up at this hearing, a licensing hearing, knowing that he's going to be kicked out of the country, and he manages in a very ingenious way to record this woman whose name was Comrade Earl Schlegel on the committee, announcing to him to his face that he no longer existed. And he said, "But I am standing here." And she said, "As a band, you no longer exist." In fact, if you look up on YouTube and you look up Klaus Renft hearing or Klaus Renft Oelschlegel, which is Oelschlegel, you can hear it. You can actually hear it. So somebody's put Renft up on YouTube with that fabulous recording that he so bravely made.
Right. Thank you.
Can I just jump in with another question there? Because Mr. Barnhurst on Twitter said that you've met and spoke to former Stasi men who were very proud of their achievements. Was it difficult to sit with them, especially since you were hearing horror stories from the other side? And obviously you were friends with people like Klaus.
I had been briefly, so I trained as a lawyer and did articles and was admitted. And I did my those articles in a very big kind of male-run law firm, which was very, very hierarchical. And then I went and did human rights for the Australian government, which was a really fantastic job. But I felt that I had had enough legal, even that minimal amount, legal or kind of confrontational or question asking training of some kind to be able to approach those interviews in the moment with the right questions and with the right kind of calm or spine or something. I was aware of what the Stasi had done as an organisation, but when I was talking to each of those men, I wasn't aware until he told me of what he had actually done. So I think that there's a difference. I wasn't sort of talking to the person who had tortured Miriam, my friend, or who I became friends with through writing the book. So yeah, but it was disturbing. It was disturbing, and the most disturbing, there were weird things that happened, like, you know, the bloke who turned all the lights out in his house that was really remote out the back of Potsdam and said to me, "I don't think the taxis will come here," and then closed all the curtains and started eating chicken drumstick in the dark. You know, he was enjoying my discomfort, and I found that kind of creepy. And he had a conspiratorial flat, or part of his house, the top part was still set up kind of like a shrine with these vinyl chairs on which people who were informers were taken secretly to be interviewed, and he was very proud of that. So there were sort of creepy, self-important men, but they were not, I didn't feel, I think I put this in the book, I didn't feel like I was talking to, for instance, they were grey apparatchiks. The very great violence that was done in East Germany, it was very great violence, was breaches of human rights and killing and psychological ruin inflicted on people, and it was awful. But it wasn't as if I was talking to people who, with their bare hands, threw people out of helicopters or were personally violent. They were evil, but they were also grey uniform wearing apparatchiks. So I was looking at people who had participated in awful things, but they were not going to do anything to me, nor could they. I think the interesting.
Anna, did you feel that they were living in the past a bit?
I found the most interesting thing was that they, I was interested in this question, and I think it's a question that I would ask myself as well. I'm not coming at this from a position of, any kind of superiority or knowing the answer or something. But if you believe in something all your life, and these men at some point, well, they said they believed in socialism. They said, well, you have to break a few eggs, I guess, meaning people or heads, in order to make this perfect state that we're making, and so on. They believed, or had come to believe, or made themselves believe, or genuinely believed in that the ends justified the means, and that the East German state was worth protecting, even at the cost of this nationwide terror, which they didn't admit was nationwide terror. When that regime fell, which was practically overnight at the end of 1989, what then happens to a human being if you've believed in something? And this would apply, I guess, to other situations, people in cults or people who lose their faith or all sorts of things. If you've believed in something all your life and then suddenly it's discredited, and you go from being a person of faith and power, in this case, to a pariah, and then a pariah faced with the evidence of this massive wrongdoing, what do? Can the human being cope with that much regret or sorrow or remorse, or what happens? And what happens that I found in my tiny sample, but a telling and accurate sample, as it turns out, according to everything else I've ever read, is that basically you continue to believe in the face of all the evidence. So they would just say to me, oh, that was one revolution, there'll be another one, and we will be proved right, was one bloke. Or, we were right, this capitalism is such a mess, it exploits everybody. In the GDR, it was safe. I could leave my front door open, and I felt like saying, well, yes, because you'd locked everybody up and you were with the Stasi, and everyone was under surveillance, no one could do anything. So it was that, I think that was what interested me, and I kind of, I felt for them in a way, but I wanted to see that. I wanted to see whether it's possible to acknowledge that great wrong, and turns out that it's probably not, or very difficult.
Okay. Carol, any further questions that are coming through on Periscope?
Yeah, there's quite
or
a few actually. We've all on Twitter. We've had, was there anything redeeming or positive about the regime, which kind of links to what you were just saying, their attitude to it, doesn't it?
Well, people now. So it's 30 years since the wall fell, and a whole other generation has grown up, and a lot of voices are now saying that there were redeeming features of that regime. Many of those people are people who didn't ever live there, people who lived there. So I was 22 when the wall fell. So anybody in their 50s grew up there, but much younger, you didn't really. People people have a kind of idealized view of it, and many grievances which exist in Germany today are kind of attached to, in the East, they are attached to a generalized feeling of, because you're in the East, you're some kind of underdog. There are enormous inaccuracies about that. So I won't go into those right now, but the redeeming features, look, if you, so I'll tell you what people say the redeeming features were. The redeeming features were that you were looked after from cradle to grave. You didn't have to sort out your own, say, insurance. There was a cap on rents. Health cover was covered. The public transport was very cheap. But even if you look at those positives, and that's all the ones I ever heard, even if you unravel those, they're not true. People say, oh, and you could travel overseas. Well, you couldn't. You could go to Hungary or Russia. You can go to some other Eastern Bloc countries. And that was only if you'd been obedient enough. So it wasn't, you had to get political permission to do that. But there was a shortage of apartments. There was a shortage of cars. There was a shortage of food. There was a shortage of medicine. So the things that people say are positive actually were not. And I think that the negatives, so living in this environment where if you wanted to do anything, you had to have your thinking be politically correct according to the government before you could, for instance, sit your final year exams, go to the university, get any kind of training, go to the job, have a holiday, get a flat, get a car, and so on. So the control over thinking was absolutely not worth the very minimal protections of a relatively minimal standard of living in the European scheme of things. So yeah, but that said, I won't go into it now, but now in Germany there's this very interesting nostalgia for the East, which is the nostalgia is real. The basis on which it exists is, to my mind, mistaken, and it is channeling a lot of present unease into this false nostalgia about what the East was. So far right, this is the irony of it, far right demonstrators are chanting, for instance, we need to complete the revolution that happened in 1989, i.e. we are still against the government. So anti-vaxxers, anti-lockdown, far right protesters are using the slogans of real democracy protesters from 89 who were protesting against a totalitarian regime. And they're using those slogans against a democratic government that is trying to deal with a pandemic and globalization. So it's a complex question. I'm giving a very important. But
no, it's great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the question. I just wanted to ask you, post-unification, you may have answered this. What do you think the challenges are for East Germany post-unification?
Well, East Germany no longer exists. It was, this is not how the people there felt necessarily, because as we've seen, say, in the US or in the UK with Brexit, in the US with Trump, a feeling of national pride and patriotism is extraordinarily important to people, and it is something that people will hold on to and will fight for and will vote against their own economic interests and well-being in the name of that patriotism. So we have seen examples of that very clearly in more recent history. If you look at East Germany, you've got 40 years of a nation which was inculcated patriotism and national pride as this sort of right-thinking, although left-thinking obviously, but humanitarian, equalitarian, egalitarian, peaceful state where it was none of those things. But still, people felt very patriotic towards their own country, and all of a sudden that country disappears. And you have, to their mind, and to some extent this is true, West German money coming in and buying up all the factories, or people coming in and... so you have to remember, at the end of the Second World War, East Germany began to exist, well, it was controlled by the Russians for 4 years and then began to exist in 1949. And they, in their own national narrative, there were no Nazis in the Eastern area. They were all of a sudden brothers with their Russian liberators, occupiers, and all the Nazis went to the West, which was not true. But the West was the capitalist fascist heir to Nazism, and they were innocent of it. So when the wall falls, you've got this patriotic lot of East Germans who have not been brought up with a consciousness of any kind of historical responsibility for the Holocaust. That was not them. That was someone else. So there are these patterns of thinking where it was not us. which allows the far right to then spring into being, and of being dominated by another power, Russia, and then West Germany, who goes in and buys up everything. And to some extent, that was kind of true, but to a greater extent, not. So East Germany was the only former Eastern Bloc country that had billions pumped into it by a wealthy brother nation, to get it going again, and where people from there could go to the West and study or work or whatever. So there's a sense of grievance, some of which is warranted and understandable, and some of which is not, given the success really of that. But it is very, of East Germany now, but it's very easy to understand psychologically.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Anna. Carol, any questions that have come on through our feeds? That'd be great.
We've got quite a few questions. A couple of people come up with a very similar question, and I think all history teachers would like to know this one. If you could pick the story of just one person out of the book that you would think would really engage readers, that would perhaps use with students, which one would you use?
I would use Miriam's story. So it's the opening of the book is, it's a really easy book to read. The book has been for 10 years on the final year syllabus in Australia for English, actually, for the general English exam for little creatures. Not in history, but it is also on history syllabi for school students and university students. I think the Miriam story is, and that comes at the beginning of the book, and then at the end of the book I go back and try and find out whether she's heard anything else, and that gives you a lot, because it gives you what it was like in the 60s, what it was like to climb the wall, what it was like to be interrogated, what it was like to be in prison, what it was like to try and deal with the Stasi when your husband has died in custody and the Stasi are organising the funeral. And they are hanging in the trees, and they have, with cameras, and they're behind the bushes with like antennae. The technology is so ancient to us now, but with antennae to listen to the people at the gravesite and so on. And then it comes into the present tense, because she is, when the Stasi were, they barricaded themselves in at the end of the regime and started ripping up the files. They started shredding the files that they'd kept on everybody, which amounted to actually an amount of paper more than the entire records of combined German history since the Middle Ages was kept in 40 years by that little country. So they shredded them, and then of course the shredders broke, and meanwhile outside there were the candlelit demonstrations going on. Then they tried to burn them, and they thought that would enrage the demonstrators, and then they tried to pulp them. That didn't work, and then they sent agents undercover to the West to smuggle in some more shredders, and then they died as well. And then they got young recruits or everybody to sort of start hand ripping these files. And because they put them away in an orderly manner, they did sort of one filing cabinet at a time and hand ripped them into big sacks. So Miriam's hopes were then pinned on finding out how Charlie, her husband, died, or what happened, or whether he was killed. This is the question of the rest of her life, and she's still actually hoping, even 30 years later, that the answer to that will be found in these 15,000 sacks, which are as big as me, bigger, of hand-ripped material. And in the interesting questions for historians and for students of politics as well is, why is it that in the 30 years since the end of the GDR, those sacks have not been reconstituted, and the secrets that were thought important enough to command hand-ripping of have not been allowed into the open? So I think that her story has a great arc and describes a great deal of courage and of perfidy and of the history of the regime.
Anna, I remember reading where you mentioned that it would take 40 workers 350 years, I think, or something like that, to actually complete the work altogether. And that really struck me.
My friend, Dr. Bertram Nicolai, who Nickolay, is the mastermind behind a scanner, an extraordinary technology developed, which will you can put a whole lot of pages on a double-sided scanner, and it will recognize the way that the rips are and the type of paper and sort them and basically puzzle them back together. But that has never, no German government has wanted to know what's in those files, and it has never been greenlit, his project, although now his technology has been used all over the world to put back papyri and ancient manuscripts and white-collar crime and terrorism materials and everything, but nobody wants to know what's in those sacks except for Miriam and people like her. Of course, the Stasi men went on to quite powerful positions in unified Germany, which is a whole other question we might not have time for, but they were powerful, and some of them hold elected positions today, because when they were talking to me, the statute of limitations on their crimes had not run out, and it was possible, they were very frightened that they might be prosecuted. And then in 2001, it ran out. And so then they became a lot more vocal and were able to, run for office and do all kinds of things. In fact, a group of them sued me about my book. So they learned very quickly how to use the law in their democratic country for their own ends, sort of to continue their persecution of people who speak out against them. Persecution is too strong. But yeah, there was a paragraph of Stasi Land that had to come out of the book when it was published in Germany, because it detailed true, I think it's on page 84. I'm not sure in the British version, it's about page 84. It detailed what Stasi men were alleged to have done in the 90s after the wall fell, where they continued to act on a presumably unpaid, unofficial basis to torment people who were speaking out against them. And I wrote about that. They had that paragraph taken out, and it never got put back in by the publisher. The legal reasoning is kind of strange for an Anglo-Saxon lawyer, because it consists in a group having a right to defend things that are only alleged about them, which is kind of a bit weird. Anyway, that paragraph has gone back in the German edition, but I said that you don't have to relitigate or anything like that, but just put it back in and then black it out, please, so that it looks like a redacted Stasi file, and the paragraph is in there and it's blacked out, and then there's a footnote down the bottom that just says, this paragraph has had to come out due to action by this organisation of ex-Stasi men. So the book has contributed in a tiny way to.
It has. And Anna, how was the response in Germany to your book when you first released it?
Yeah, so the response was as sort of, I was extremely naive about so many things, probably still am, but I thought at the time, some kind of shamefully naive, really. There were so after the Second World War, well, in Germany there are many, some of you will know, there are many statues and streets and squares that are named after Hans and Sophie Scholl. Hans and Sophie Scholl were this very brave young brother and sister who leafleted against Hitler in 1942 and were executed. And the Germans are proud of them. That's like a homegrown resistance of a kind. And I thought I was finding resistance in East Germany to a regime that everybody else assumed, East and West, was absolutely a sort of blanket covering of a downtrodden and dismal people. And that was not the case at all. I mean, you don't have to have so much surveillance unless there's some kind of resistance. And what is it about humans that makes us so brave? And, a schoolgirl, an alcoholic rock star, a housewife, dental technician, what is this core of something in humans that makes us know what's right and wrong and what we won't do to one another? That was what was so interesting to me. But yeah, I thought this will be celebrated in Germany. I couldn't have been more wrong. The book came out in Germany, maybe 2004 or something like that. I went on a big 10-city tour of Germany, and I guess the response in brief was as divided as the country itself. So the people who had been against that regime, so that democracy activists, civil rights activists, and their liberal broadsheet media, the response was very positive to the book, although a little bit bewildered on two counts. One, that I was Australian. Two, which I can go into in slightly more detail. And the second one was, why does nobody else in Germany talk about this issue? And so why has an Australian come along, and then why? So there was sort of a little bit of that. And then the kind of the sort of Stasi newsletters, and, you know, there wasn't much of that going on. They weren't as outspoken then as they became later. But I was interviewed, for instance, by a former East German journalist, and journalists in socialist regimes are basically spokespeople for the government. And she was furious. She was furious. They were completely not used to anybody who was against the regime or stood up to the regime having any kind of platform to speak. So it was just a shocking thing to them. I sent the chapters on the Stasi Men, or to everyone actually, to everybody before publication, so the Stasi knew what was coming. And also I wanted to be corrected in case I got anything wrong. But I didn't hear anything back from them. But on my tour of Germany, it was really interesting speaking in Leipzig, which is where the book was launched at the massive Leipzig book fair in 2004. And it was rather really wonderful when I look back on it, because it was launched in the Runde Ecke, so in the former Stasi building, in this great big kind of ballroom, really kind of secret policeman's ballroom. And I was there. My publisher was a West German woman, and she got up and spoke on the lectern, and I was in the wings. And I looked, and I could see that her knees were knocking under her fur coat. I could see that there was a short fur coat, and then the knees were knocking. And I thought, wow, she's more frightened than I am. That's so weird. And then I thought, oh, that's not weird. That's just not good. It's not very celebratory. And then I got out there, and I looked down, and I saw in the front 2 rows of this event were all ex-Stasi or ex-party men, because they were all furious, and they were all dressed in like grey zip-up jackets and like bomber jacket things and polyester trousers and lots of Brill cream, and they were all of a certain age, and they all looked the same, and they were definitely Stasi and party men. And as soon as I started talking, they started taking notes and kind of huffing and puffing and being really furious at me. And I realized, I just thought, sort of got a bit steely, and I just thought, wow, you can't, like, what are you taking notes on me here for? You know, what are you going to do with your notes now? It's 2004. You can't scare me with your notes. And also, I got my own notes on you right here. And so I just read. And then when the event was opened up for questions, they all got up and really loudly scuttled out. And this happened, it was a 10-city tour. So there were, I think, 3 or 4 of those cities were in the former East. And this happened, some version of this happened in all of them, only after the people who looked like they had worked for the regime had left the room. And they had been there to, you know, eyeball me, as we say in Australia. Only when they had left, somebody would stand up. And in Leipzig that night, it was a woman who stood up at the end back of the room, eventually in question time, and said, what I don't understand is why it takes an Australian to tell these stories. Why can't we talk about it ourselves? My son was imprisoned by the Stasi here. So the courage it took that woman to say that when she's talking about her son being imprisoned by people who might have been just in that room right then and who only just left. And at that moment, I think it finally dawned on me that this book was coming soon on the tale of history in this really divided place, and that history was not history. That was by no means over. Justice hadn't been done, and people were frightened of who was going to be in the room with them when they were talking about it. So it was a very interesting response. I have to say, it's still only, there are memoirs by people in Germany, and there's an awful lot of study in the same way that people like to study the Nazis, they like to study the Stasi. So the perpetrators hold a distinct fascination. For me, my greater fascination is definitely in the people who resisted, and also the fact that this was sort of confusing in Germany. They don't have a long tradition of whatever you call it, if it's literary nonfiction or kind of personal nonfiction, or they didn't quite know where to put this book. Is it a fact book, a history book? Is it a travel book? Is it a personal account? They didn't quite know. But yeah, the response was interesting, and still I think Stasi Land is really the only book of its kind about that regime, which surprises me because there are so many stories to tell.
So did you speak to any? Sorry, Andrew. Did you speak to anybody who was an informer and maybe suffered any backlash or got protection? Was one of the questions from Twitter.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the informers were harder to find. The people who rang me on my line after my silly ad were people who were Hauptamtliche, is the German word. So they were employees of the Stasi, either off in uniform or off in an office or teaching at the university or spying in the West. The people who were informing on family and friends, so, you know, your aunt or your best friend or your teacher or whatever, if they hadn't been outed, they didn't want to out themselves by talking to me, obviously. People really went to ground for reasons you can totally understand. And some people had been under awful pressure to inform. And everybody really knows, unless you're the most extreme psychopath, pretty much, that you don't inform on your brother, sister, friend, mother, colleague. So the feeling for informers is really an awful one. I did have one informer ring me up, and he was breathing very heavily. He was very distressed and or kind of agitated, and said I was an EM, which means an inoffizieller Mitarbeiter, an unofficial collaborator, which is a store pigeon, a spy, an informer. And he said, I will tell you everything that you want to know. And I was really pleased. I said, I don't need your name. I really would like to meet and talk. I'm trying to get my head around this, how it was then and how it is now for you. And he said, what are you paying? And I thought, for one thing, I was so broke. But, you know, I would have found the money. But then I just thought, wow, you have been paid already one time, even if it was a pittance, even if it was mostly protection. But you have been rewarded once for betraying the people around you. I just don't think I can do that again. I don't think I can pay you again. So I didn't get any EMs. I'm not sure that was the right decision on my part. Maybe I should have just, you know, gone with the Stasi flow, found the funds and paid for a story. But I think too, it would have been interesting, whatever the veracity of a story that you pay for, and I know there are big questions around that as well. You know, maybe I should have. Didn't.
Hindsight's a great thing. Look, I'm conscious of the time, and I know that it's late for you in Sydney. Karen, is there any last questions on our feed, the History Behind feed?
Yeah, actually, Gareth's story was on Twitter quite a long time ago, but I thought it fitted more towards the end. He said he thinks the book will make a fantastic film or a documentary. Has there been any interest, and would you want to do it if there was?
So there has been quite a lot of interest over the years. It was a play was commissioned by the National in London and written, a really beautiful play. It was never put on, and it's currently being made into a television series. So, but it's being made into it's a television series that will stick closely to the book, but it's I suppose it's a fictional series in that way, but it's actors and it's not going to talk to people, but it's, so it's being done. So it'll come to Netflix or whatever, Hulu or Apple or whoever it eventually goes to in the next couple of years, hopefully.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Anna.
I must apologise to anybody who did send a question to that we've not had time to put forward. We have tried to put forward as many as we could, and we do appreciate everybody sending them in, so thank you.
I probably talk too much, but as you can tell, I can keep talking.
Anna, it's been absolutely great. Thank you very much. Look, I just wonder, have you written anything in lockdown?
How are you guys going? Yes, it's just we in Sydney, so various bits of Australia have been in various different kinds of lockdown, and in Sydney we've been very lucky. We had a lockdown for a few weeks last year in April, but really we've been so lucky. I'm working on another book, and so I've just continued to work on that. And again, it's a 4 or 5 year proposition, but it's a non-fiction book, so again, it's a kind of untold story, but it's an untold story with a historical element, actually, and a biographical element and a feminist element. So if that sounds like a dog's breakfast, I don't know what else a dog's breakfast could be, but anyway, fingers crossed it'll turn out.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Anna. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's got involved today, everyone who's joined the feed. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors, Pupil Premium, Time Travel Education, and Wellbe. Without them, we wouldn't be able to support the channel. We wouldn't be able to have interviews like this and the work that we do with Teach Meet History Icons. And just a very quick plug that the Teach Meet Icons Cognitive Science Special will be Saturday, 6th of March, just at 9:30. So if you'd like to join, we would really like to have you there. And it just leaves me to say thank you very much for your time this evening and just giving us so much insight into your wonderful book. We really do appreciate it.
Oh, it's such an honour to talk to history teachers of the UK. Thanks for having me.
Thanks ever so much.
It's been wonderful.
Okay.
And take care.
Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Bye.